Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Chase, the Executive Director for the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation. And as a quick bit of housekeeping before we begin the session here this afternoon, please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on demand via Zoom and then posted publicly on social media. And we will also make a copy available on our website at www.uscfcr.org. And at the end of the conversation, we're going to open up an audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions. It's down at the bottom here. And this event will run approximately 1 hour with the potential for added time depending on the number of questions that we have from all of you. And with that, on behalf of CFCR and our partners and friends at the U.S. Cannabis Council, who are co-sponsoring this event with us today, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to this intimate conversation with Michael Hausfeld and Steve Gelsi. Michael and Steve will be openly discussing antitrust law, including how to identify and avoid anti-competitive practices. Our guest today is Michael Hausfeld. Michael is widely recognized for his leadership on competition matters. His distinguished legal career includes some of the largest and most successful class action suits in the fields of human rights, discrimination, and antitrust law. And today's host is my good friend, Steve Gelsi, a senior financial reporter at MarketWatch. Steve started writing about cannabis in the early 1990s as a freelancer for High Times, when few professional journalists were doing so. He continued to contribute to High Times while working in a variety of roles, and he rejoined MarketWatch in 2021 to lead their cannabis coverage. So on behalf of CFCR and USCC, we thank you all for joining us today. And now, Steve, I'll allow me to hand the mic off to you to start the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Michael. Hello and welcome to the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation and the U.S. Cannabis's conversation with our own antitrust lawyer, Michael Hausfeld, on antitrust law in our current cannabis consolidation environment. I'm Steve Gelsi. I'm the moderator for this discussion. The discussion is on what every cannabis executive should know amid tie-ups in the industry nowadays. I'm a longtime cannabis journalist and I cover the industry for MarketWatch.com, along with banking and private equity, strangely enough. The recording of this event will be available on social media, as Sarah said, and the CFCR website. We'll also have at least 2 Q&A sessions during the presentation in the middle and at the end. So just put those questions into the chat box and I'll read them to Michael Hausfeld. Michael, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Steve.
Okay, so Michael, you've been involved in some of the highest profile legal battles over human rights, discrimination, and antitrust law, whether it's fighting to get NCAA players paid or working with owners of Volkswagen diesel cars in a case around cheating emissions tests. In January, you became chair emeritus at the firm you started called Hausfeld, named after you. So what drew you to the cannabis sector now?
There was a time several years ago that I was in Amsterdam with my granddaughter, and we were standing outside a store that was selling candies, cookies, cakes, and I was wondering whether she would like some of them or any of them. And she said, "No, Papa, I can't do that because this contains this much cannabis, that contains that much cannabis." And she went through the whole thing about the distinction between THC and CBD. And my eyes were rolling, but behind me was a young couple and they were laughing hysterically. I turned around and said, "Why are you laughing?" He says, "It was just wonderful seeing, a 10-year-old trying to explain cannabis, to her grandfather." And at that point I decided, yeah, I think I better learn about this.
Yeah, and this was probably before it became legal in a lot of states. So you're a little bit ahead of the curve there of other people of getting interested in cannabis. I guess you saw the potential for it in the U.S.
I saw the potential not only in the U.S. but literally worldwide that this was an emerging industry.
So before we get into specifics, of antitrust law, you have a long track record being involved in cases involving antitrust and corporate law. So where do you see the cannabis industry today in terms of antitrust law? That's, put on your sort of knowledge of corporate America and sort of how does it sort of fit into your arc of your career and where do you think cannabis is at now and from a regulatory standpoint, kind of broadly speaking?
At the very beginning of the frontier of antitrust accountability. You've got an emerging industry with a huge, potential in a number of different fields, and not limited to any geographic area, or source of distribution.
Right. So it's kind of early days then, I guess, as you're saying, maybe like perhaps compare it to maybe the internet early days or something like that, right? So it's kind of kind of an early phase in the industry.
Absolutely.
Okay, so just to refresh some memories here, cannabis companies have been rapidly consolidating to scale up. It's been kind of a land grab. It's also a way to ease the huge costs of being a cannabis company, like having to deal with the 280E tax rules. So we've had Trulieve bulking up by buying Harvest Health for $2.3 billion. We've had Tilray's $2.4 billion acquisition of Afria, and Cresco Labs is combining with Columbia Care. You've also seen a big move into the industry by spirits giant Constellation. They've invested in Canada's cannabis growth. So you've already got a lot going on, but it might get even busier. Michael, we've already seen some antitrust law at work, particularly around the state level with cases in California and Illinois. Specifically in California, we had Richmond Compassionate Care Collective versus Cozoil et al., in which a jury last year awarded a $15 million award against a group of medical marijuana collectives for conspiring to prevent a competitor from opening a competing dispensary. So these issues are coming up. Can you run through some of the basic pointers on what cannabis executives need to know on this important legal front?
You've got at least two levels, of antitrust concern, federal and state. At the federal level, you have the antitrust division of the Department of Justice, as well as the Federal Trade Commission. You've got concerns under sections 1 and 2 of the Sherman Act, dealing with price fixing and monopolization, and sections 7 and 8 of the Clayton Act, dealing with mergers, acquisitions, and interlocking directorates. At the state level, you have issues of unfair methods of competition, which would include all of the above, plus unfair methods of advertising. You've got, as I said, combinations or cartels with regard to price fixing. You have single firm offenses in terms of monopolization and conspiracies to monopolize. You have oligopolies, which are collectives of sellers. You have oligopsonies, which are collectives of buyers, all of which run you directly into antitrust accountability.
So that's a pretty wide range. What do you think is the most, the low-hanging fruit here for executives to really look at and to really kind of break down with this?
I think you started off with the right area, mergers and acquisitions, the consolidation within the industry. Right now, clearly, this present administration is very concerned about concentrations of power in particular markets. And I think cannabis represents a prime target for that kind of scrutiny or oversight because of the health dangers that people at least perceive are associated with the product.
Yeah, we had a ban on Juul this week too. So I don't know if that has any impact on the cannabis industry, but that's for tobacco products. But it kind of have to worry about any kind of regulatory action that's going on. There was a we mentioned the California case. Could you run through the details of Cresco Labs divestitures required for its acquisition of Columbia Care? That's kind of an early example of antitrust law at work, where a company had to kind of get rid of some properties. Are there any lessons from this action?
I think the action was characterized in a publication as a group boycott, but I don't think it was a group boycott. It was more of just a conspiracy to restrain the trade of an emerging competitor, where properties were gathered up that the competitor could have used to retail its product and foreclose from acquiring those properties, essentially making it difficult for them to have a source of distribution. That is, an old-fashioned cartel that's basically foreclosing at this point, outlets for the sale of their goods. That is one method. Then there are no poaching agreements. There are territorial allocations. There are customer allocations. You've got three levels that you need to be concerned about in any industry. One is the growers. Two is the sellers. For example, what concentration would there be if tobacco companies started to, to acquire cannabis companies at any level? You also have big tech companies causing a concern. What would happen if cannabis became, a product, like toothpaste on Amazon? Is that going to give, Amazon an unfair advantage by reason of its platform in reaching consumers, so that becomes the platform to be used in the end user purchase of cannabis products? And then you have the end users themselves, who basically give up what information in order to acquire the particular product, in terms of concentrating power in the hands of either the sellers, distributors, or growers.
So it's on multiple levels, and this is all happening in real time. Is there anything, you kind of mentioned a lot of potential sort of flashpoints that are out there for cannabis executives. Is there anything that's kind of really safe that's out there that if you, let's say if you're a company and you don't have any presence in a state, and you just want to buy a company that has like a tiny bit of presence in a state, is there anything that's kind of like going to miss the bar on this in the M&A world, that people don't really gonna have to worry about much of it? I mean, of course you have to worry about all these aspects all the time, but is there any kind of safe harbor there that you can see anywhere in terms of M&A?
Not with cannabis, again, because of the additional attraction that it has for governmental or regulatory oversight by reason of the nature of the product itself. I think the government is going to be very interested in whatever acquisitions or consolidations there are, which bring about a concentration of dominance or power or control within any aspect of the market, whether it be growers, sellers, or distributors.
Okay, so it's one more headache, I guess, for regulatory headache for cannabis executives to deal with, but they're already used to dealing with a lot of regulatory headaches. What's the good news here? I mean, I guess there is a way to charter a path through these types of things if you're careful, if you take the right steps, if you do the necessary due diligence. It's all about the due diligence, I would think, right?
It's about the due diligence, and you've got a product which is growing in demand exponentially. So you've got to figure out how you exercise that due diligence to basically maximize or capitalize on the market value of your product.
Okay, so we've got a case in Illinois. Another case involving some antitrust stuff in Illinois. Is a lawsuit by True Social Equity in cannabis. And they're suing Akerna, Green Thumb Industries, Verano, and Certera. The complaint states that these companies share pricing information and collude to charge monopolistic prices as part of the Chicago cartel. Although the suit is expected to get dismissed, are there any lessons here? I guess there's, as you're saying, there are a lot of tripwires out there.
It's very much like a market situation where you're trading stocks on an open exchange. That type of information, is publicly available and does not violate an antitrust law. When you have competitors exchanging pricing, not just on products that they're selling at the moment, but projected pricing for products to be on sale going forward, you're running into exchanges of information that reach what they call competitively sensitive information, which the Justice Department, considers within the ambit of antitrust accountability.
Okay, so that's another thing to look out for. So we talked about a couple of statewide situations in Illinois and also in California. On the federal level, cannabis companies have been filing Hart-Scott-Rodino paperwork, but you haven't had any major Federal Trade Commission rulings against any mergers recently. But we did have allegations from Justice Department officials that Trump Attorney General William Barr in 2019 staged antitrust probes into cannabis company mergers and allocated resources to do so. All told, Marijuana Moment reported that 6 of the 10 probes of mergers resulted in nearly 6 million documents. So this is another headache that had to cannabis companies had to deal with. So I just wanted to mention this as a background to your thoughts on how is the FTC going to wade into cannabis in the future. Is there any political agenda by the Biden administration on this front. The president has not been considered a major supporter of cannabis. So is there anything executives need to think about the current administration? Also, do you have any thoughts on any impact the midterm elections may have on antitrust if Republicans gain control of Congress? Couple of questions there, Biden and then midterms and FTC.
I don't see anything right now at the FTC in the present administration, which is focusing on cannabis as such. But I do think as the demand for the product grows and the volume of the product sold grows as well, more attention is going to be paid, to that product and who is controlling its distribution.
So it's going to be something perhaps, what would be a tipping point for that, you think, where they just kind of like as it gets to a certain size, it's going to just attract more federal involvement, I guess?
It also depends upon who is attracted to the markets. Are the tobacco companies going to enter, in a big way, into the sale and or distribution or growing, of cannabis? Are the big tech companies going to get involved? Are any companies that right now exercise market dominance in any particular one of those areas with the large agricultural companies, which would be able to clearly outmaneuver a small grower in terms of farmland, for example, or just production volume. Any one of those aspects that bring about the attraction of large players will bring about an attraction equally, of governmental oversight.
Right. And I just want to mention, I forgot to mention that Altria has also made some investments in cannabis as well. So I think nothing really, astronomical, but a pretty significant investment. I'm not recalling the facts of that now, but I do remember writing about that at one point. So in terms of, where you're seeing, any of the warning signs right now that the federal government is going to be involved, it doesn't seem like it's going to be imminent, but the midterm elections are imminent. Do you see any smoke screens or any sort of trial balloons from the Republicans on how they might want to approach antitrust law?
Depending upon obviously who gets elected, if any one of those electors have a predilection against cannabis for personal or other reasons, they may request accountability oversight more so than you would see if those political inclinations were absent.
So let's walk. We're gonna come to a juncture for questions pretty soon. Can I just put a hypothetical out there for you? Do you see yourself, in your legal career, you've really spent a lot of time kind of defending the little guy and the little guy and the little woman, I guess, not just guys, but do you sort of, what kind of battles do you think, because are you going to be seeing, because, corporate America, the corporate interests like tobacco companies are going to have a lot of resources to fight these antitrust battles. And do you see yourself more as in a position of maybe helping the entrepreneurs or trying to work with the little guys on this type of stuff?
It would all depend upon the question presented, but for the most part, you can see large agricultural companies trying to possibly come in and take up the farmland for growing purposes.
Yeah.
You can see large entities, like Altria, or any of the other tobacco companies coming in to control, the sale. Large wholesalers, to control the distribution. Possibly big tech companies, to control the end use connections. So there are many possibilities in this industry for there to be oversight by the government with regard to antitrust accountability at both the federal and state level.
Right. Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions here. We'll go to these. We have a question here. How and where do you get help for a landmark cannabis case? This is just in the state of Oklahoma. Someone's looking at the growth in the state of Oklahoma, and what kind of resources are out there, I guess, for folks who want to try to get some guidance on these types of issues?
There are clearly any one of the law firms, involved both locally and or nationally, that have an antitrust, capability. Should be consulted.
Okay. All right. So there's a lot of players already involved. And did you think law firms that handle antitrust cases are becoming more aware of the cannabis issues in general? Like, obviously after they listen to this webcast, they'll be more aware of it. But I mean, is that something that's kind of working its way into the legal community, into the antitrust kind of antitrust section of things?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll see that. So reach out to your local folks there in Oklahoma, and anybody who's worked on Federal Trade Commission, and they would probably be able to maybe help you, or at least point you in the direction of learning a little bit more about these types of issues. So we have another question here. As much as cannabis monopolies need to be broken up, they're not remotely as harmful to nearly as many people as big tech monopolies such as Google, Amazon, Apple, etc. If there is no appetite to take on those monopolies that really matter, do you think there is actually any willingness to take on cannabis ones? That's a pretty interesting question.
I think the balance tips against the cannabis companies, because with regard to the big tech companies, you're talking about invasions of privacy, how you spend your money, where you spend your money. With cannabis, you have all of that plus your health.
So maybe the follow-up question here is, do you feel the cannabis monopolies will be scapegoated and take all the heat as Congress comes down on them exclusively and ignores Amazon? In other words, yeah, are they going to be getting more heat just for the fact that they're cannabis companies?
I don't think you'll have anything occurring to the exclusion, of issues relating to Amazon or Google, but you may have unusual attention paid to cannabis industries because of the potential health effects that it has on people, particularly young people.
Yeah, that's the, yeah, I mean, just an aside comment. I mean, that's the other thing that's been lacking is research, definitive research on what the health effects are and what the health benefits are. There's just still a lot of noise around that, and there hasn't been as much research as perhaps as is needed. So it's kind of like another one of those examples of how the industry is kind of like trying to fix the flat tire while they're driving the car. So here's another question from a reporter. How does federal illegality limit the federal government's ability to police competition in cannabis?
I don't think at all.
Okay.
If you're engaging in conduct that violates the antitrust laws, they're just adding to the illegality of what they're doing. So one doesn't preclude the other.
Okay, that's interesting. And I forgot to mention, we're going to move on to I've got a few more questions for Michael. I forgot to mention that I just wanted to say a little bit about the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulation. It's been advocating to ensure that federal regulations are informed by and grounded in science, best business practices, and social justice principles. That's one of the group's guiding kind of principles. The CFCR is chaired by founding partner and entrepreneur Sherry Orlowitz, with Sarah Chase as executive director. Its board members include Mark D'Souza, who is CEO of Penrose Therapeutics, and Jim Esquia, who is VP of Public Affairs for Scott's Miracle-Gro, and Ted Thompson. He's the SVP for Public Policy at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And so we've got some other issues to talk about here. So Michael, how does the antitrust landscape change if marijuana does become federally legal? I mean, you just mentioned that antitrust regulators could step in at any moment, even though pot's illegal. But if pot becomes legal, I guess you'll have a lot more big companies maybe trying to wade into it. And what effect do you think that might have on antitrust law and antitrust activities?
I think that it will accelerate antitrust activities to the extent that there is behavior or conduct which approaches the lines of antitrust accountability.
So you think this would sort of speed up consolidation, though, right? I mean, if it's federally legal, it would sort of give the green light for a lot of companies that have been on the sidelines to just kind of wade into it, I guess, and get involved. And so it's going to be a free for all, I guess, of mergers.
If the federal government lifts the illegality, of the federal accountability, then you're opening the market, and with an open market, you're going to attract, more players.
Probably internationally too. I mean, people be coming in not only just in the U.S. There'll probably be players coming in from overseas as well, I would think. All Are there any concerns around potential cartels involving large tobacco or liquor companies wading into cannabis? As we've mentioned, Altria and Constellation are just a couple of the bigger companies that have been kind of nibbling at it right now, but they might come in a lot harder, if it's federally legal.
The answer to that would be yes, not only from what you mentioned as cartels, just manufacturers or sellers of liquor, sellers, tobacco products. You've got issues dealing within those industries, whether there is a cartel formed with regard to price fixing or any of the other types of violations, territorial allocations, customer allocations, whether some will say, okay, you take everything east of the Mississippi, we'll take everything west of the Mississippi. Every one of those, once you open a market that at least right now has almost an unlimited or infinite potential, as cannabis does, you're going to be attracting people who are going to want to maximize, whatever they can reap out of that emerging market.
It's funny because now what you're saying is going to motivate companies to merge even more quickly before the big players come in. So I think that's what's driving a lot of the M&A right now, is that they want to at least try to bulk up as much as they can before, Altria wades in big time, or Constellation or somebody even bigger, or Amazon even wades into it at some point with almost unlimited resources. So that's kind of driving some of the deal activity now, I would think. But it's harder to get capital at the moment for mergers. But I'm kind of touching on a bunch of different points here. But it just does seem like, do you think that's kind of like driving people? People feel that is going to happen at some point. So that makes people more willing to consolidate now.
I clearly think that that's a sense going around. It's easier and smarter to bulk up while you can, as opposed to, when all of a sudden the giant has his or her foot, on the back of your neck.
Yeah. So is it, if I'm a cannabis company, let's say I'm a multi-state operator, and I want to just kind of buy it, and I'm only in 2 states, and I want to go into another state, it wouldn't seem there's any antitrust concerns there either, though, right? Because you're going into a new state where you're not before. Would that be a pretty safe thing to do if you're a cannabis company?
You may avoid federal antitrust scrutiny, but you may run into state antitrust scrutiny.
And the state would be concerned with what? I mean, if you're not even in the state and you're coming in, they want to make sure that you're not going to buy too much of a market share in that one state.
They may not be concerned with you coming in, as such, but they'll be concerned with, once you are in, will you exercise, control, which would basically limit competition or allow you to increase prices over and above what the market would otherwise demand if there was competition.
Okay, so in terms of the M&A activity, then you are seeing that, and if you are a marijuana executive, I kind of asked you this already, but let me re-ask. What's the first thing you should do if you're thinking about merging with somebody? What's the first thing you should do with antitrust? You should assume that you're going to trip some kind of regulatory review and just take the right steps to kind of get legal help on that front, I would guess.
Get the best advice that you can as to what the potential downside would be if you proceed, and or at least be aware of what challenges that might be raised, if you do try to consummate the acquisition or the merger.
Okay, well, let's change gears now for a second and talk a little bit about M&A law and some of the how that's evolving, because that is going to have some bearing on cannabis and M&A and antitrust. So we have the Justice Department and the FTC in January launched a public inquiry aimed at modernizing merger guidelines to better detect and prevent anti-competitive deals. And you've submitted, I think, about 130 or 140 pages of comments on this particular effort. It'd be interesting to hear some of your major points there on that comment.
It's not just the United States, but regimes outside the United States as well are looking at their merger and acquisition guidelines to see how they need to be adjusted, if at all, in light of new market realities. And there's a lot of adjustment being considered in terms of looking at whether or not either industries as a whole or platforms are acquiring too concentrated of power, which would necessitate some diffusion of that control and or prohibition of any further acquisitions or mergers, either horizontally or vertically.
So where is that at, and how long do you think it'll take before that kind of all gets finalized?
Europe has finalized it and has issued a new CMA Act, which is radically revamps merger and acquisition accountability rules and regulations. And the US is far behind in terms of just first putting out the request for comments, and then they would have to actually issue the new regulations for publication and then enact them.
So the upshot of it is that it's going to kind of modernize M&A law in some ways. Is there any potential effect on cannabis directly on from these types of changes?
Clearly, because you're dealing right now with a more fragmented industry, there's going to be a lot of dynamics in terms of greater consolidation through either acquisition or merger. So I think there's going to be more activity, which will mean possibly more oversight and regulation.
And is there, I'm kind of asking this question kind of, just on the spot here. Is there any kind of antitrust case that you think that you're familiar with, any kind of landmark case that might show some kind of lesson for cannabis? I mean, we mentioned there have been a couple of cannabis cases in a couple of states involving antitrust law. What do you think is like the most major antitrust case you think that might have some bearing on cannabis? I don't know. This was not a question that we talked about before, so I'm just kind of throwing that at you cold. Sorry.
I'm not sure that any one stands out because, again, this is a newly emerging industry. And I think you're going to just run into all of the problems in terms of pricing, allocations, territorial, customer, boycotts, mergers, and acquisitions.
Okay, good to know. So, all right, so let's flash ahead into the future. Let's assume that cannabis is legal and it's say 10 or 15 years from now. Is the cannabis business going to look like perhaps like the alcohol business with craft brands competing with mega brands? What's the vision here for a fair marketplace that's been freed from monopolies and cartels?
Let's start with the genesis. I think are you going to see an industry dominated by ADM or Cargill, where they become, the premier or dominant growers, owners of the farmland and control over the volume of plants? Then you've got the issue of sellers. Who's really going to control or exercise market presence, in the sale, of the products, and which products is it going to go into? Because cannabis has a lot of use, so there's no limit to the types of products that it can be put into, which means that there are various industries that will be involved in that aspect, of the distribution. And then you have the retail. So it's an industry which is going to face all of the problems right now that you've seen, throughout literally antitrust history in terms of government regulation and accountability.
And now, Michael, one of the things you've been able to do in your career is figure out ways of doing things that other people haven't been able to figure out. Like, there was talk for years about getting pay for college athletes, for NCAA athletes, and I don't know, somehow you figured out a way to do it and you did it. Is there any kind of an approach to cannabis that you're thinking about, or you're very creative in a legal way? I don't know. I'm just trying to ask you in terms of what opportunities do you see out there to really kind of shape things to create a more level playing field? Are there any kind of like really egregious cases out there that you think you're going to focus on, or just any kind of opportunity you think to sort of take a different angle on what's been done so far in terms of antitrust and cannabis?
Let's use the word that you just included, opportunity. There is an opportunity in the cannabis industry for companies basically to get that advice now, before they act, and then wind up in proceedings to determine how best to go about achieving what they want, without running into crossing an antitrust line.
So there's an opportunity there. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of refresh everybody's memory, I think the cannabis industry right now is maybe 20 or 30 billion dollars a year in the U.S., and it's going to probably, and that's the legal business. So it's going to grow. In New York alone might be a $5 billion market once it gets up and running. So there's a lot going on. Michael, is New York State on your radar at all? Because that's a very hot area, in terms of the cannabis industry. It's going to be probably the second largest. It could be the second largest legal market in the U.S. after California. So has that been a focal point at all for you?
There've kind of been three major areas that have expressed interest with us. One is the West Coast, the Midwest, as well as the Northeast.
Okay, so the North, but right now it's probably mostly California.
Yes, that's
Okay.
that's the most active.
And are there any cases right now that you can talk about that you're working on out there?
No.
Okay, but we'll stay tuned on that. I'm going to throw it out, see if there's any more questions here from the audience. I'm pretty much getting close to my end of list of questions here. Here's something about Rhode Island. Rhode Island is moving towards legalization. Here's the question. It says, as a single state, the smallest, Rhode Island, cultivator, this is a cultivator in Rhode Island, how would you suggest I make my company as appealing as possible to mergers and acquisition options? Or do you think the smaller, primarily indoor growing areas will be left behind completely? Or will some antitrust activity actually benefit smaller companies? So this is, yeah, there are a lot of mom and pop companies out there. And how are they kind of affected by all this antitrust stuff that's going on?
Antitrust activities would help, and benefit the smaller companies. That's what they're made to do, allow small companies to compete, evenly, in the market. It's when markets become tilted by dominating companies that these smaller companies are basically squeezed out.
Okay, so yeah, so do you see an opportunity for your firm to try to protect some of the smaller companies, or at least make sure that there's no laws being broken that would kind of prevent them from thriving?
That would be a good thing for the market, to maintain market integrity and have the greater number of competitors available to keep the best goods flowing at the lowest prices.
And you don't really think the FTC would actually prevent a cannabis merger, right? They would probably usually just kind of require certain divestments in certain markets, perhaps, but the merger probably could go through. I mean, that's what usually happens in a lot of cases. Usually the deal, I mean, in terms of antitrust cases that I've seen, usually there is the merger is allowed to proceed, but they do have to divest certain things.
The comments submitted to the Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as the new regulations by the European Commission, call for regulators to reject mergers and acquisitions, as opposed to let them piece off elements of the proposed merger or acquisition. So no, I think right now the current thinking is it would be more likely to see the federal and/or state regulators reject any merger or acquisition, as opposed to allowing it to go ahead in some modified form.
Okay. So just to kind of touch on some of the major points that we've kind of touched on, you can't, if you're an executive in the cannabis company, you can't do enough planning. Is number one. Number two is antitrust law is out there already in the state level and the federal level, and they could step in at any time. So you got to be prepared on that front. And number three is, if you're a little guy, you can get protected by antitrust law. So you just try to know what your know what the protections are. Michael, are there any other kind of points that you'd like to drive home here to summarize and kind of start wrapping up our presentation here.
You're dealing in a market which has huge opportunities and significant growth. If you pay attention to it, that's the best way to navigate, not crossing a line, with regard to antitrust accountability.
Okay, Michael Hausfeld, thank you very much for joining us. I want to remind folks that the recording of this event will be available on the CFCR website and also on social media. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks for the questions from folks. And thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody else at the
Thank you, Steve.
CFCR.
Bye-bye.
Bye.